Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Morning Blast with myself, Ryan, and of course, Michael, your very, very, very canned market podcast with no airs and graces. Our main role and job here is to put a smile on your face in the morning and add some considerable value to your day. Usual caveats apply. Nothing discussed on the podcast is trading or investment advice. Do your own due diligence. The podcast is labeled explicit for a reason. There's a lot of profanity, and we do not apologize for that. Michael, good morning.
Very good morning to you, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday, almost the end of the week. And according to our good friend Clive Lambert, it's a monumental day in history. The Titanic's just sunk, a man's just been put on the moon. They've just done the 4-minute mile for the first time, etc., etc., etc. Never let it be said that Clive Lambert of Futures
Finger on the pulse.
Finger right on the pulse of financial markets.
I could see that coming. For those of you that don't know, Clive was asking us if we were aware that CME was halted yesterday.
14 hours after it happened.
Anyway, enough of my. He did tell us to not be so nice to him, so there you go.
Yeah, there you go.
I'll tell you what, speaking of Clive Lambert, let's get his market updates out of the way.
Well, let's hope his technical analysis is better than his time.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure I can vouch for that. I'll put my name to that. Anyway, Clive Lambert, our dear friend Clive Lambert from Futures Techs. Market update from him. S&P saw green yesterday. We now reference 69.38 as the Marabuzu support. The Nasdaq finally saw off the 25.045 and headed to the next Fibonacci target at 25.545. There's a lot of fours and fives there. Eurostoxx summary is it's going up. Eurostoxx and the FTSE futures both made yet more all-time highs again. Obviously, for those of you keeping track, all-time highs normally, beget more all-time highs.
Indeed.
The DAX, that's lagging. Obviously, the German benchmark index. Bund futures, sticking with Germany, that held Marabuzu support at 129.52 on a pullback, almost to the tick. That's bullish. Cable continued to rally away from the 200-day simple moving average, and the euro-dollar also saw green. But once more, dollar-yen bucked the dollar weakness trend. It's all right for the dollar to be weak, but if the yen's a lot weaker, that's what happens. Bitcoin, that staged a decent turnaround to avert some of the recent bear threat, trading up to 70,000, where we found some opposite trade. That means sellers. Gold, the yellow metal, and silver posted high wave candles. I'm going to have to check what that means in the book. Another name for a doji. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Clive.
And he's just trying to confuse us at this. High wave
He's just making stuff up, to be honest. I'm sure he's just throwing stuff in there, making it up.
He probably could, and we wouldn't realise.
I would read it. Just be very clear. It's very obvious that the first time I read a sentence the first time I look at a sentence is as I'm reading it to you. So he could really stitch me up. I'm hoping I haven't put some ideas in his head. Anyway, silver that has now migrated to the May contract. We continue to favour the bulls in these two. We did say, both of us on the show, and also I think Clive did as well. After we had that absolute shank in metals, the underlying kind of background behind the trade hadn't changed. So there's, our money was on it, just grinds back higher anyway, but a more consistent and more kind of respectable tone rather than the sprints that we had previously. Copper, Dr. Copper, got up to 13,350 late yesterday, so making bullish noises once more. I'm very happy for that one. Full disclaimer, I'm long copper. Nickel held Marabuzu support at 17,610 on a dip, so that should cheer the bulls as long as that holds. Brent posted yet another doji, so we continue to flag that the bulls may be running out of steam for now. Obviously, we've got the geopolitical situation in Iran, more on that in a bit, but we've also got OPEC coming out saying they're going to start hiking again, which is something to keep an eye on. So there's a lot of dynamics in play in crude space at the moment. Gas oil, which to you and me, that's diesel, saw another dip in European diesel, dip through 715, finding buyers. So we're still with the bulls there. Henry Hub, US gas, that saw more weakness and is gunning for a gap below 2.766. This side of the pond, TTF nat gas, which is the, think of it, the Henry Hub equivalent, it's the European benchmark, tried to recover yesterday, but it wasn't convincing. So still with the bears there. Ditto the EU carbon markets. Over in the US, in ag space, soybeans have hit the resistance at 1,169. This is something we flagged yesterday. Above here, 1,170 is the overnight high as Clive went to print. We're at levels last seen in June 2024 for the front contract. And the next upside target is a big zone up to 1,258 through to 1,265. We could head there quickly with little in the way of resistance between here and there in the meantime. So want to keep an eye on if you are involved in the ag space. But from Clive, that's it. And for me, for now, that's it. So thank you very much, Clive.
Good. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Clive, as always. Right, let's have a look at some of the machinations that we saw in financial markets yesterday then. I'm going to get cracking with NVIDIA, first of all, because actually up until NVIDIA reported at about 9:30 last night, it was quite a dull affair, to be completely honest with you, as is often the case, when for anyone new to markets, if you've got a huge bit of event risk on the horizon, whether that's a major earnings release or a central bank meeting or whatever it may be, rationally and logically, market participants don't really want to be doing much before that event, which could upend whatever theory or trade strategy that you had in advance of the event, which is why we typically see lower levels of conviction into these major market events. In any case, NVIDIA delivered a classic beat and raise on their fiscal Q4 numbers, EPS coming in at $1.62 on revenues of $68.1 billion, both of those above consensus expectations. Data center revenue also beating expectations at $62.3 billion, and that was all delivered on a gross margin of 75.2%. So very, very solid figures in isolation. NVIDIA also raised their guidance for fiscal Q1. They see revenues between $76.5 and $79.5 billion in the first 3 months of their 2027 fiscal year. And CEO Jensen Huang was pretty bullish in terms of his commentary on the conference call after hours. Again, note that none of this guidance assumes sales to China, which NVIDIA believe will still be at zero throughout the next reporting period.
Just one flag there. Yes, officially at zero, but we kind of, we've had DeepSeek even this week saying they were being accused of training their latest models on NVIDIA chips and stuff. So yeah, officially the sales numbers are always going to be zero to China. But I think Jensen and everyone else we all kind of understand that it just means that those numbers have been moved to Thailand or Singapore or something like that.
Yes. And I think also there is obviously the other thing that we often say around NVIDIA, which is there is some degree of upside risk to those guidance figures if they are officially allowed to sell to China as opposed to coming through the back door.
Exactly that. And I think it's something worth flagging because I fear that a number of people will see those numbers and see that there's zero allocated to China and then go, oh, well, when China starts buying, that number's going to go up. Well, yes, the China number will go up.
But just come off somewhere else.
But yeah, exactly. So it could be net flat.
Yeah.
So this is something just to be mindful of. It's like, it's like with tariffs and stuff. Is all of a sudden, you stick tariffs on one country and all of a sudden your imports from the country next door go up. And it's like, well,
sanctions as well.
Exactly.
I think it's Ed Conway at Sky has done a lot of research. So obviously this is massively tangential to what we're discussing. But
great word.
There we go. However, obviously the UK has put a load of sanctions on Russia and various people within Russia. So exports of luxury goods and cars from the UK to Russia have gone to basically zero. At the same time, exports of those goods to Azerbaijan have gone through the roof. So you don't need to be a fucking expert to tell me how the Russians are getting their luxury stuff out of the UK.
Yeah, as an A-level geography student, I know stuff like this this and Oxbow Lakes. Yeah.
I'm not sure there's much call for Oxbow Lakes on a.
I'm waiting. I'm waiting
sadly,
for a time when I can shine with Oxbow Lakes. It's been 30 years, man and boy.
Oh, dear. Right. Well, while you wait for that, I will crack on. NVIDIA traded up about 3% on those figures. They did pair about half of that move by the time the after-hours session closed. We will see where they open up in pre-market trade when that gets up and running in about 20 minutes' time. We did see a bit of a pop in the S&P and NASDAQ futures on the back of the results, but again, that fizzled out and both of those trade flat this morning. In terms of other catalysts from yesterday, we're going to talk geopolitics in a second, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but relatively hawkish rhetoric continuing to emanate from the United States. The crude front, we had some sources stories regarding OPEC yesterday. Bloomberg citing delegates noting that OPEC Plus are set to resume what they called modest supply hikes from April. Of course, there is an OPEC Plus meeting on Sunday where they are set to consider an output hike of 137,000 barrels per day, which would be in line with the pace that they were bringing production back online before they brought that to a pause at the start of Q1. Besides that, here in Europe, Bloomberg did a survey of economists yesterday. Apparently 70% of those surveyed believe that ECB President Lagarde will be leaving the bank early before her term is scheduled to expire in October of next year. The majority expected that if a departure is going to take place, it will take place by December 2026, i.e. later this year. That the most likely successor for ECB President Lagarde is former Dutch central bank governor Klaus Knot, who is basically a shoo-in for the job if he wants it, I think, given some of the reporting that we've seen recently. And then here in the UK, before we move on to quite a few topics worth discussing this morning, two things from the UK first and foremost. Again, geopolitically, this is weird, by the way. The BBC had an article out yesterday afternoon citing a Foreign Office minister, a chap called Hamish Faulkner, what a name that is, who said that effectively the UK has paused ratification of this Chagos Islands deal to discuss more of it with the United States. About half an hour later, a government spokesperson came out and said, no, that's completely untrue. The deal hasn't been paused. Quite why one of their ministers said it had, I don't quite know. So that's a bit of a political hot potato that continues to be thrown around across the Atlantic.
Just on that, my take when something like this happens, and this is from just watching countless episodes of the UK version of House of Cards, and like, yes, Prime Minister, is they blatantly have been paused or at least slowed down.
We don't want to tell anyone yet.
Yeah, someone's told the truth, and that they're like, well, hang on, the truth isn't the official party line, so we've got to walk it back. And then you can imagine someone in the office going, well, hang on, but it is the truth. Yeah, but that's not the official party line.
Yeah, Sir Humphrey somewhere has had a heart attack in seeing that published on the BBC front page. The other thing, just in the UK, the FT reporting this morning that net gilt sales are going to decline for the first time in 4 years. Gilt issuance is expected to just shy of £250 billion for the fiscal year 2026-2027. The FT laughably then said, and I quote, as Chancellor Rachel Reeves seeks to rein in borrowing, which is potentially one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen on those pink pages, but nonetheless, it says a lot about.
And it's a high bar for that, because there is quite a bit of ridiculous stuff on the pink pages of recent years.
Indeed, but that is all from me for the time being. So where do we want to start?
Okay, well, we were just talking about the UK. Let's start with the UK. So obviously today is the long-anticipated Gorton and Denton by-election. Now,
I live for by-elections in northern constituencies I'd never heard of until 6 weeks ago.
Quite. And obviously you can tell how little even politicians have heard of it, because both the Greens and Labour, whilst campaigning over the last month or so, have both spelt Gorton and Denton wrong on two separate occasions.
Oh, for God's sake.
On official materials. So people in the UK might be wondering, why is everyone talking about this by-election? People outside of the UK are definitely going, what the fuck's a by-election? Basically, think of it as a very local election. Why these matter, especially in like smaller areas, they don't normally. But obviously things have been so tragic for Labour, and this has been, forever been a very very strong Labour seats. Like for instance, in the last election there, they won with 50.8% of the vote.
Labour of just on that, Labour of Gorton and Denton, the predecessor seat was Manchester Gorton. Labour have held those seats continuously since 1935, and they've only lost an election once in that constituency since 1906. Which gives you an idea of when we think about Labour heartlands, this is about as close to that as you
exactly
can get.
So people are looking to the results from today's election as a bellwether for, more broadly, nationally speaking, how fucked Labour are, because they are fucked. It's just how fucked. So obviously we've got the two other parties going against them, which is obviously Reform and the Greens. And it is pretty much a three-way split. It's, there's not much to call it in terms of the recent polling and stuff. But obviously the pollings in these the sample size is so small. Like everyone was getting all frothy over a YouGov poll yesterday. And the sample size was 401. So, I mean, you go down the wrong street and you're going to warp the results. But interested to see your thoughts on this, Michael. Obviously, I kind of put out a question yesterday and made sure I flagged our good friend Helen Thomas, who is the expert on all of this, in terms of what's worse for Labour. And everyone made very good cases that a green win would be the worst, even though Reform are being touted, as the racist right and all this bollocks. But the reason the Green vote is seen as more damaging for Labour is because you could argue that many Green policies are left of the current Labour power. So, do Greens look to split the Labour vote and the left vote? But what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I think it is going to be interesting. And actually, as you sort of alluded to there, the mere fact that we are talking about it and the media on a whole, it's leading, every news bulletin, it speaks volumes about how we are in terms of political sentiment here in the UK and how unsteady Keir Starmer's leadership is. Speaking of Starmer, I think it's important to note that he will have absolutely no choice but to own the result, no matter what that result is. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, because if you think back to when the by-election was called, it was Keir Starmer's allies on the Labour National Executive Committee that actually blocked Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham from standing in the seat. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is actually quite rare, usually in by-elections, members of the cabinet and certainly the Prime Minister stay well away from the constituency so that they can reasonably say afterwards, well, it's just a protest vote against the government, nothing to do with me, pal. Well, guess who was there on Monday? Keir Starmer himself. So he's actually been out campaigning for a candidate that was effectively handpicked by him and his allies at the top of the Labour Party. If this goes wrong, there's no hiding place. And I think this is important because one of the things that's at the heart of the recent flare-up in political instability here in the UK is politicians within the Labour Party calling into question Keir Starmer's personal and political judgment. Because, of course, you've got to remember, it was his own decision to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the US. It was his own decision to block Andy Burnham from standing in Gorton and Denton. So I think if Labour don't win the seat, the political pressure will ramp up much further on the Prime Minister, although my working assumption is still that he somehow muddles through until the local elections in May. They are a little over 2 months away. There's not really any advantage for someone to move now as opposed to waiting until after those elections. However, it just increases the likelihood that someone will indeed move after those elections. I think I would agree with the consensus from your sort of poll and from what Helen was saying regarding losing to the Greens will be a lot worse than losing to Reform. But actually, I think the worst result for Labour would be losing to both of them and coming in third, because that's then a real sort of damning indictment from the voters in that constituency of the government of the day. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. We'll probably get the results overnight, early Friday morning. I wouldn't be staying up for it. I don't think it's going to be a vol event for markets when that result comes out. However, what we see on Friday will be very interesting indeed, particularly in terms of people like Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, Andy Burnham, Ed Miliband, those senior Labour politicians. How do they react to the result? And also what is in the media in terms of, sources reporting and all the rest of it.
Exactly that. I was about to say that exact same thing. It's not so much the results that I'm worried about and markets should be looking at, it's the fallout. So, we're talking Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the Sunday papers, basically, where do we sit on there? And we should know probably by Monday, we'll have a bit of an idea. Does it look like Starmer's going to make it to May, or are they going to act quickly? Because if they do want to get rid of him before May, it will have to be very, very sharpish to get their ducks aligned ahead of May. But personally, I think we both agree they'll probably wait till May and let him own that, and then
the other thing with that, and we will move on very, very quickly after this. The other thing with that is, I think if they were going to move before May, it would effectively have to be a coronation. We don't want you anymore. We're going to bring in X, and everyone is united behind X. The Labour Party is too split for that to happen.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Right, next thing to quickly move over to US-Iran talks, round 3 in Geneva today. So this is the third round of indirect US-Iran nuclear talks in Geneva, mediated by Oman's foreign ministry, who's delivering Iran's latest proposals to the US team. Previous rounds, round 1 was in Muscat, round 2 was also in Geneva. Obviously, the US side led by Steve Witkoff, which is Trump's special envoy, and Jared Kushner. Obviously, both sides say that progress has been made, but significant gaps remain. there's a lot going on here. One thing I would say, and before we go into too much, into this, it's all about the language used after, when they leave the building today. If we hear productive, it means, it continues. The talks are like getting better. If we hear unacceptable, that's kind of going to be, if, think of it in terms of when I was trading on headlines and stuff and trading crude and stuff. If I heard from the US officially that it was unacceptable, to me, that means the military option moves considerably up the queue, because things are getting to the crunch point. Trump has set a deadline for a deal to be resolved next month, which is obviously March, and that deadline is approaching quite rapidly, and there's no framework. So again, it'll be, no one's got an well, unless you're Russia with a little spy camera, or China with a spy camera inside the talks, you haven't got access to it. So again, it's all about what is said afterwards. I'd be very careful if it's just one source says this or one source says that. Try and work out, there's always, it takes a bit longer, but you're always more informed if you kind of can piece together what both sides have said. But what's your thought on this? Because obviously the direct impact is obviously the crude markets.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think the other thing that I would just add to that is not only the language that's used, but also are the reports that we're getting from both sides, do they match up with each other?
Yeah, exactly.
If, for example, the Iranians come out and say the talks were very, very productive, and then, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if the Iranians say that it's been productive, and then there's reporting that, Witkoff and Kushner don't view things the same way, that's a bit of a red flag to actually these things are starting to break down. So, I think it's not necessarily a binary outcome in terms of markets, but I do think the natural response will be, if the talks are not productive, if there is not progress made in these discussions that take place today, the market is naturally going to even further ramp up its expectations that we will see some sort of military action within the Middle East, because of course you've got so many forces amassed in the region kind of ready to go. So I do think it's very much almost a question, when you boil it down, of, are we going to get a deal today? Almost certainly not. Let's be completely honest. What we're really looking for is progress towards that deal. The Iranians making some sort of concessions that are enough for the US side, for Witkoff and Kushner, to go back to Trump and say, it's worth us having a fourth round of discussions. It's worth us having another conversation. We should keep the military option on the back burner for the time being. I think that's really the key thing to focus on. The other thing is, there's going to be a fuckload of headline noise. And a lot of those headlines are going to be conflicting, because if you get yourself in, and I'm not slagging off the media here, right? This is just their job. But if you get yourself into the mind of a journalist, there's this massive event going on. You want to be first. You want to be the one with the scoop. You want to be the one who moves the market. You want to be the one who gets your news out there before anyone else. And also the people involved in those talks. There's going to be a lot of officials involved who also want their little moment in the limelight as well. So do be very, very careful in terms of the sources you're using. As you rightly said, Ryan, ideally you get the news from 2 or 3 sources before you actually build that into any sort of market view that you might be forming. And also bear in mind that you could get a headline at 9 a.m. and then a headline at 9:15 that completely contradict each other, and the market goes one way and then goes completely the other. So it's going to be it could be a bit of a noisy and messy day, frankly.
It's one of those that I would always tell people, look, unless you've been trading oil and trading headlines on oil for quite a considerable time, it's very easy to get sucked into trying to trade every headline. If you do that, you'll just get topped and tailed, and you get fucked up the arse.
Now is not the day to try headline trading crude. For the
exactly that.
If we're being honest.
Exactly that. Because in your head, when you're planning it as a trader, you're picturing the perfect binary headline. Though I can promise you those are very rare and far between, increasingly so as more journalists, more talking heads are on Twitter. And as you said, they want to put their name out there. But yeah, so one to keep an eye on. Obviously, we'll see how how this kind of dust settles after today. Obviously, Friday, if there's nothing conducive to a significant improvement, we'll probably see some risks kind of premium being put into the market tomorrow ahead of the weekend, as we've seen pretty much all the time. And then if nothing happens over the weekend, we'll get that
premium again. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to play the game. But thirdly, and finally, before we have a brief look at what's ahead today, just a quick flag on the CME outage yesterday. It's not for those of you who don't know, CME Globlex, all metals and natural gas futures and options trading stopped yesterday for an hour or so, 50 minutes on technical issues. There's no machinations and background backroom kind of conspiracies about trying to do this. I saw the usual pundits saying, "Oh, maybe a big market maker got margin called." No,
Yeah,
it's nothing.
JP Morgan can't get physical silver, so they shut the whole fucking market down. No, they didn't.
It's nothing to do with that. Yes, it happened on a expiration day, which adds another element of complexity, because obviously one thing goes off the board, so it's very possible that things go wrong on that side. But at the end of the day, this is all software based, right? And we all know that software can go wrong. Things can happen. I'm not saying any more like it happens these days, but back in the day, the wrong switch could be pulled, right?
Yeah.
And it shows you how little experience people calling these, every time this happened, people calling it as a conspiracy, or they're gaming the system, and all, just shows you how little knowledge they truly understand of these markets and these the exchanges. Because if you've had any experience in trading, like my good self, man, 25 years, man and boy. I remember non-farm payroll pretty much for a significant amount of time, going back 15, 20 years, pretty much every non-farm payroll, Eurex would go down, sometimes for a couple of hours, right? This, the fact that these events are now so rare, I think is testament to how well and how strong exchange matching engines and software is these days, because we've come a long, long way, and rightly so. But just because something goes down doesn't mean that there's a big conspiracy against you. And they did. Everyone was also saying, "Oh, you couldn't put orders in." Well, you couldn't put orders in because the fucking markets were down. And they did. They did exactly what they normally do, which is pull your good today orders. They left if your GTC order was already in the system, it was recognizing that, so that stayed in the system. So it wasn't like they were pulling all the GTC orders. It was textbook. If something goes wrong, this is how we fix it, and it was all brought back up within an hour. These things happen. I saw like Peter Brandt coming on claiming that Terry Duffy's going to have a big lawsuit against him. Fuck off! What absolute garbage.
No, I fully agree with you. As I often say with this sort of thing, cock up over conspiracy, ultimately, at the end of the day. And it's annoying, but also no real harm done. The markets weren't moving that much at the time anyway. And anyone who had an order pulled, just go and put it back in when the market reopens. It's really not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Anyway, should we do the day ahead?
Yeah, I would just very quickly, one thing I would say, and I've got many friends at the CME, and full disclosure, PIQ does have a commercial relationship with CME. I promise you, that's not impacting my reasoning on this. I think anyone that knows me knows that I call my best friends cunts. So trust me, it's not nothing to do with that. If I did think CME were at fault, I would tell them. And I will say one thing that such CME should do is they should provide better post-incident transparency, because technical issues, quote, technical issues, isn't enough when it's something like this. If they really want to, tamp down on these conspiracy theories, they should give some more granular insights to what exactly went wrong. But that's just my little piece on that. But what else is happening today, my friend?
Yes, indeed. In terms of the day ahead, then, another pretty barren data docket here in Europe, and actually similar stateside as well. The only notable release comes at 1:30 this afternoon with the weekly jobless claims figures. Initial claims expected at 216,000, modestly up from a prior 206, while continuing claims expected at 1.86 million, unchanged from the prior. Do note that the continuing claims print does coincide with the February non-farm payrolls survey week. Besides that, the Treasury supply for this week wraps up with a 7-year note auction at 6:00 this evening. The 5-year sale actually tailed a little bit yesterday, somewhat messy, which wasn't ideal. On the speaker slate, we hear from the Fed's Bowman. She's talking about banking regulation this afternoon. ECB President Lagarde is speaking right now in the European Parliament, while we're due to hear from the BOE's Claire Lombardelli this morning. And on the earnings front, I think earnings season is as good as over at this point after the NVIDIA report yesterday, but we do nonetheless hear from the likes of CoreWeave and Dell after the market closed. And then last but by no means least, overnight we have Tokyo CPI figures from Japan, with the CPI number expected unchanged at 1.5% on a year-on-year basis in February. And that is all from me this morning.
And that is all from me. Look at that, dead on 9 o'clock, top bombing. I guess I might be seeing you later for a beer, perhaps.
I believe you are.
Maybe. Lucky me. Listeners, Michael first. Thank you so much, Clive. Shout out to Clive. Listeners, thank you so much, especially all of you that tune in to listen to this live, especially those that listen live from the US of A. So welcome. And